Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Progressive American. As always, I'm your host, Connor Kelly. There is a lot to get into in the week's news, so let's just jump into it. Today, the impeachment proceedings are coming to a close as both the defense and House managers make their closing statements. In all likelihood, Trump will be acquitted yet again, since conviction requires a 2/3 majority and Democrats only control 50 seats. This was despite the threats that Trump's supporters posed to the members of the House and the Senate. Even more damning is the fact that Trump himself knew how severe the situation was, as Senator Tuberville alerted Trump to the fact that Pence was being let out, and yet still tweeted that Pence had not done what he wanted him to do, effectively turning the mob against Pence. As of recording, there are 40 senators who support convicting Trump, 38 who oppose it, 20 who are open to conviction, and 2 who are not certain. Among those against conviction is Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. There were some whispers that McConnell would provide Democrats a strong rebuke against the Trump wing of the Republican Party, but that was always a fantasy. Chances are McConnell waited until the end of the proceedings to make his opinion known when attention on him was the least intense. In other words, the turtle was hiding in his shell. I want to be clear about this. Impeachment was necessary, but it was always a long shot. If Trump was left alone with no consequences for the danger of his rhetoric, others like him would try this again. And though the vote to convict will probably fail, it is important to remind the American people that some opposition to Trump's violent conspiracism still remains. Indeed, for many a legislator, the events on January 6th were traumatic to say the least. In an interview with PBS, Senator Patty Murray explained the terror she felt that day when insurrectionists attempted to find her in her office.
Well, I came to the Capitol that day, as I do every day, and it was fairly loud outside. I had heard the president speak, and I was very aware that this crowd was pretty, negative. And so I texted my family and said, I'm on my way. I'll let you know when I get safely to the Capitol. And I did. I texted them, and I said, I'm in my office. I'm safe. That turned out to not be true. I was there because I was going to be one of the first speakers on one of the first challenges, and I was preparing myself in an office very close to the Senate floor when all of a sudden I could see out the window the people who were protesting were no longer protesting. They were breaking through. They were angry. They were yelling. They were loud. And I still felt, well, I'm in the Capitol, I'm safe, because that's what we feel. And it wasn't long before I heard explosions, I heard yelling, and all of a sudden they were in the hallway outside my door. I was inches away, along with my husband, who was with me at the time. And we were really frightened. We were hearing the announcements to stay locked down. We heard loud explosions. My husband yelled at me to get down. We were lying on the floor. And all of a sudden they were in the hall. They were yelling. They were yelling that they had breached the castle. They were yelling, kill the infidels. And we heard somebody saying, we saw them, they're in one of these rooms. And they were pounding on our door and trying to open it. And my husband sat with his foot against the door, praying that it would not break in. I was not safe.
The fact that a member of the United States Senate was not safe from a violent mob of insurrectionists should not go unnoticed. We need more and more members of the legislative branch to come forward to talk about their experiences, because it is increasingly evident that not enough of an issue was made over the potential for assassination. These people, many of whom did not vote, tried to forcibly overturn an election and turned one of the most sacred sites of American democratic order into a temple to anarchy and treason. Trump will likely be acquitted, but America will have to endure the consequences of his treasonous rhetoric for years to come. In lighter news, the Department of Justice has reversed its position on the Affordable Care Act. Under Trump, the act was subject to DOJ arguments against its existence and constitutionality, which falls outside the traditional position the department usually takes when it comes to federal statutes under lawsuits. Usually, the department would defend the government law in court regardless of whether or not the person defending it agreed with that position. But on Thursday, another tradition was broken. The DOJ reversed its argument that the Affordable Care Act should be struck down in a case known as California v. Texas, which seeks to overturn the entire law, potentially throwing 20 million Americans off their health care. However, with the DOJ refusing to attack the law any further, the state of Texas's position may lose some legitimacy. Though the outcome seems unlikely to change, indeed the court appears inclined to uphold the act on severability grounds, which means that if they struck down the individual mandate, which would reverse the 2012 decision, they could still uphold the act itself without the mandate. Currently, the penalty for not purchasing insurance stands at $0 after Republicans voted to neuter the mandate's penalties in order to provoke a lawsuit. Personally, I don't see why the Democrats don't just restore the mandate to its full power, as that would render Texas's suit moot. But I think it's worth noting that at the moment, the federal government is not coming to take 20 million people off their health insurance, and that's a win for the public. We'll be right back, and I hope you continue to listen. Welcome back to the Progressive American. We really appreciate your time. In addition to the recent shifts in legal arguments regarding healthcare, there is yet another legal win for progressives. The Biden administration has begun to enact policies against housing discrimination against LGBTQ Americans under the Fair Housing Act. This comes just a year after the Supreme Court ruled in its landmark case, Bostock v. Clayton County, that gender identity was protected under Section 7, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. The decision by the Supreme Court, coupled with Biden and his administration's quick reaction, is a welcome change as it ensures that millions of Americans will no longer be subjected to bigoted landlords who refuse to provide basic housing to them. Prior to the decision, 21 states did not have any explicit prohibition against discriminating against a person on the basis of their gender identity. But with the federal government's new position, LGBTQ Americans now have a recourse against those who would deny them basic housing. Indeed, the Victory Institute reported that transgender and gay men were statistically less likely to be offered apartments by landlords than their cis counterparts. Hopefully, this decision will start to change that for the betterment of our society. In international news, China has decided to take the BBC off the air in its territory, as reported by the Washington Post on Friday. The foreign minister for the United Kingdom, Dominic Raab, called it, quote, an unacceptable curtailing of media freedom, end quote. The decision came not long after the BBC aired new evidence of forced labor in China's cotton industry, specifically targeting Uyghurs. The BBC also aired evidence of systemic rape against Uyghurs by the Chinese government. Of course, China denies the allegations, but the retaliation is a clear sign that China will not tolerate criticism of its government. Indeed, the Chinese have also arrested an anchor for an Australian TV company in China, alleging that she was a spy. This came after Australia formally requested the United Nations conduct a probe into the abuse of Uyghurs across the authoritarian state. Ultimately, it is unclear whether or not the Chinese will return the BBC to broadcasting, and it is unlikely that any of the arrestees will be released. But with the increased hostility of China to outside media and general criticism, the world should be increasingly wary of China's influence as it expands outward. That's all for the Progressive American. We will be back every Saturday at 10 a.m. CST from this point on. We had to cancel our last show due to an RSS issue, but now that that's done, we should be available to you all for the next couple weeks with no problem whatsoever. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed it.